this episode, we catch up on a host of edits, talk Ceibo and Noosa Fest with Lucy Small, and delve into the happenings of the third CT of the season in Portugal, including a resulting discussion around the way we talk about women surfing.
Shan, I am looking forward to having that discussion at the throughout this episode. Before we dive into that, we just had a really fun week together. On the last episode we had, I think, or not the collab that we've just done with the lineup, obviously, but the one before, we were chatting and I said, hey, you don't know this, but I'm actually planning on coming to stay with you for like a week in a couple of weeks. And that ended up happening. And so we just had so much fun together. And you worked yourself to what's the saying I'm looking for? Oh no, this is not a good start.
To the deathbed? I'm so tired.
Pretty much. We jam-packed it. Yeah, we jam-packed it.
It was so fun. It was so nice having you and Jake come to visit. And I was just off through the week, the days that you guys were here, which was really fun. So I kind of made like a mental calendar of like, here are the great things in our area in the Illawarra that I want to show you so that one day you think, oh, I want to live here. And this place is beautiful and fun and there's great surf and all the things. And my pregnant body I have so much fatigue anyways, while also having this little energy second trimester happening, which is awesome, that I took you guys to do like everything I could think of that was fun, that I should have like tapered out across 3 weeks, and we did it in 3.5 days. And I'm literally, and then I worked like just after for a couple days. I'm so tired. My eyes can hardly stay open right now, but we're going to do this and we're going to have a great discussion also throughout the week of like all the fun things that we did, which Rach, I'll let you take this back in a second. But we were basically the discussion we're going to have towards the end of this episode that was sparked through some comments made around Portugal and women surfing. We just have had this discussion now for like a week straight. And every morning we like wake up and be like, I had this new thought in the middle of the night. So yeah, I'm excited for where this is going to end up going.
I really enjoyed that. Like we were going on these long hikes, and the hike at the end would have these rock pools in it, and the walk there and the walk back would just be discussion about, well, what do you think if it was phrased this way? Or, well, how do you think like we should be talking about women surfing in this light? Or what are your opinions? And there was 4 of us there to just like ping pong off each other. And it really fired me up. So I'm excited to be getting on mic now shortly after that and chat through it all. But Shan, before we get into kind of that deeper discussion that we'd like to do, we're going to do our monthly roundup where we talk about kind of the happenings that we have seen take place throughout this past month. Yeah,
the first really big news out of that, which is so cool, it kind of spans more than just surfing. It actually is much bigger than just what surfing is. Global sport in that whole conversation, and, kind of glass ceilings being broken on the women's side. If our audience may or may not be aware of this already, but there is now officially a first female IOC president for the International Olympic Committee, which is absolutely incredible. It's Kirsty Coventry, who is from Zimbabwe. She is not only the youngest and the first ever female IOC president, but she's also the first to represent Africa. And she's a 7-time Olympic medalist across her swimming career. Now, the cool thing about Kirsty coming into this conversation is that she has served on the ISA board as one of the vice presidents for a number of years, and that's been her major involvement heading into this IOC role. So we know that also surfing is sitting in a pretty good position in her mind coming into this new role.
Yeah, I think that's a really exciting information in terms of surfing on the global stage. And when it comes to Olympics, and we have this discussion too, that hopefully more disciplines, longboarding and so forth, get added as the years come on. But I think it's really awesome to celebrate just in general as like the first woman in that role and everything. But to have this woman who has served in surfing and is very familiar with our sport and the ins and outs and the politics behind it too, I think is a really positive thing for our sport. And I do think we will see, oh, sorry, I just hit my mic with my hand. That made noise to you in your ears, but
certainly did.
For a podcast that you're only listening to, I'm still using my hands to describe what I'm trying to say. That's a quick note. You can also watch this episode now.
On YouTube. Wow.
On YouTube. Anyways, yeah, I think that is a really awesome thing for surfing, and congrats to Kirsty on her new role. Also noted that we did see Sally running for that vice president role to be on the board for the ISA, and Sally did get elected into that. So we did, as we saw Kirsty step out of that, Sally pretty much walked into that role, and now we have her as a representative on that, as a vice president on that ISA board.
It's just all so many good things happening, like within that IOC conversation, within the ISA, to see these women stepping into these roles and to see Sally in that new position as well. There's a quote that's been going around. I've seen it posted on a few different news sites from Kirsty Coventry about her taking on this IOC role. And she just says, "Glass ceilings have been shattered today, and I am fully aware of my responsibilities as a role model." And I just think like her coming into that role and sharing that that's her feelings coming into it, knowing that the firsts that she holds as a woman, as the youngest, as an African, she is a role model across a lot of different aspects in that conversation. And I think that's, it would be amazing if more people walking into massive leadership roles would walk in with that kind of mindset. And I feel like she's someone with the character as well to uphold that moving forward. So I'm really excited for where that's heading. And I also think even, just a quick note on Sally walking into that ISA role, she's also someone who's going to view herself in that sort of position. She's got the character to back her beliefs and her statements within serving. And I think for her to be, who knows, like at whatever stage Fernando Aguirre steps down from his role as president, Sally could be an amazing person to take over that kind of role. Like already looking at her with her credentials as a surfer, as well as what she's been doing behind the scenes. To match that with the character and the type of person that she is, I think is incredible. So all around, really huge news for women in kind of surfing and in global sport as well.
Absolutely. And while we're on this Olympic conversation, Shannon, I'm going to tangent us real quick and just kind of give it, surprise.
Why not?
Give listeners, I guess, just an arrow to go look into this as well, is that there is a power struggle happening in the U.S. Olympic Committee at the moment.
Oh my gosh,
with USA
I'm so glad
surfing.
You raised this.
Yeah, so
wild news.
It is wild news. So right now there is a power struggle for who holds the rights as the national governing body for surfing within the USA under the recognition of the U.S. Olympic Committee. So basically what happened back in 2021, the U.S. Olympic Committee, right after Tokyo, deemed that USA surfing was not doing a good enough job. At the time, they might even still been branded as Surfing America. I know there was a rebranding. That might have happened or whatever. Maybe it was already USA Surfing. Doesn't matter. USA Surfing wasn't doing a good enough job as the national governing body with the funds that they were being allocated, blah, blah, blah. And so USA Surfing is board voluntarily stepped back as the national governing body, reset their CEO, reset their board members, all of this stuff, did a bunch of internal investigation, internal work, with the opportunity then to reapply to be the national governing body. So now that there is this kind of ticket open, and I will say within amateur surfing or ISA surfing, USA Surfing does continue to run all of our ISA teams, all of our championships. It's just more from the USOPC recognition and Olympic conversation. So they are getting prepared to reapply to be that USOPC national governing body. The benefits that come with that, one of the main ones is a good sizable chunk of funding to pour into the sport. So as they are applying, US skiing, not as ocean skiing, as in snow skiing. Yes, which is in charge of skiing and snowboarding as the USOPC recognized NGB. Sorry, there's a lot of acronyms there, but they basically see this opportunity of this kind of power grab, and they are now applying to also be the national governing body for surfing, which from the get-go does not make much sense. As you go deeper, it still does not make much sense. But interesting points to note is that the current CEO of US Skiing is Sophie Goldschmidt, which is former CEO of WSL. Obviously, she's familiar with surfing. And I think my initial impression of it and conversations I've had around it, this is not a good step forward for surfing, that we do not want surfing to be allocated under US Skiing. Benefits to them in this is basically just more funding as an organization, which they can then allocate to surfing kind of in however much or little they want to. As the organization of US Skiing, obviously skiing and like snow sports is their priority.
Yeah.
So I don't see in any way how this actually would be super functional or productive for surfing. It's just kind of how I see it at the moment, as I'm still like learning and uncovering about this. Like I've just learned about this in this past week. It's basically just a power grab. And anyways, there's kind of the quick snippet, but there is a lot of information that has just gone public about it. A lot of USOPC, I guess, like not super integrity.
You're talking like members of the USOPC.
Yeah, are kind of, there's like some kind of, maybe collusion sounds like too heavy of a word to be using, but there are.
It's a pretty odd thing for skiing to try and take over surfing in that
like
sense.
Things
of
that
things.
You're seeing, as far as I'm aware, these two governing bodies have to go and speak in front of the USOPC board and basically like give their spiel of why they think they should be the national governing body. The application, USA Surfing's application for this has been shared to US Skiing, but US Skiing's application has not been shared back to USA Surfing. So there are, it seems, there are members within USOPC that would benefit as well from this. Like just, it's not super cut clear.
And it essentially hasn't come in there. It's not a fair playing ground right now. Like US Skiing is being given the upper hand already in, like you said, seeing the application from US Surfing, not being asked for as many questions or as many requirements as what US Surfing is being asked for in comparison. And so there's a lot of questions around, like you said, the integrity of why the organization would want to do this. I just also find it so interesting that the former WSL CEO, who knows a bit about surfing, obviously, and Sophie Goldschmidt, is now heading up US Skiing and would have eyes on something like this. She's obviously a very smart and sharp person who has done a lot in the tennis world as well. For her to potentially want to benefit the organization she's currently working with, I could see that being a motivation as opposed to necessarily going, hey, let's help make US surfing this better thing. Like it just doesn't, nothing about it so far in the track record and what USA Surfing is sharing with the, the kind of surfing public at the moment has given green lights or positive feelings about the entire situation for like new opportunities or anything. It's quite the opposite. So really interesting one to be tracking. And I'm thankful, Rachel, that you're in a position of, you're as a multiple world champion, but as, I can't even remember all the roles that you fill within like the USA Surfing scope. I know that there's like some multiple things that you're doing there, that you're now at a place, where publicly you can start sharing that this is happening.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I know the Inertia just did a story on it. I think there's been some press releases written about it now. So if you are interested in that, it's again kind of off the back of where we started this conversation in Kirsty and the IOC. Obviously, this has nothing to do with USOPC, but that kind of Olympic conversation and how surfing interweaves into that. USA Surfing and the US as relation to Olympics is currently in turmoil. So if you find that interesting, go read more about it.
So wild. Well, let's shift focus and continue moving forward in our monthly roundup. One great thing that's been happening here in Australia, Rachel, you and I have had kind of tag team years of being involved from the first to the second year for Seize the Day, which is a massive women's surfing festival day that happens in Kingscliff, which is up in northern New South Wales near the Gold Coast of Queensland. And that is coming up June 21st and 22nd of this year.
Yeah, an awesome program that we have been, like you said, fortunate enough to be a part of over the past few years. And it is such a fun weekend, Shan. There are talks done by multiple different hosts in which you and I have both been able to sit in those roles prior to. There's last year there was a surf contest alongside it, like a tag team. We saw Lane Beachley down there, Pauline Menzer, Kate Myers, so many amazing different names coming from. I think the cool thing about this program or this weekend, the Seize the Day weekend, is it is coming at women's surfing and the women's surfing industry from so many different lights and aspects, not just coming from a competition focus, but you're hearing some of your favorite photographers like Kate Myers talk about what she did to get the success that she has in the industry. You're talking to more like Liliana Bowery, who we're going to talk about in our next segment, Shan, going into more of like the free surfing and edit focused parts of her career rather than the competition focus. I just think there's a lot of different angles that are spoken about. And I think it's such a cool initiative and a really cool way to meet your role models here in Australia and in women's surfing and the people who are really making waves and making impact. So if you are a young girl or a woman interested in surfing, absolutely go attend this weekend. You're going to meet so many amazing like-minded women who are passionate about the sport, passionate about the industry, and I guarantee you will make friends.
It's also free. So if you are wanting to, yes, basically the way that it runs on the weekend is that it's a completely free weekend. Anyone's allowed to come. It's obviously focused towards women and young girls within that surfing community, but really just that active lifestyle as well. And alongside of, like you said, surf contests and speaking engagements that you can go and listen to, there's a whole wellness center set up. There's great like food and entertainment happening. So it's kind of, it really encompasses that like festival sort of feeling. But again, everything's totally free. That said, because there are some really specific like surf contests, there's surf lessons being given. So if you've never surfed before, you can go down to the beach, whether you're a grom, a little kid, or someone that's older that's wanting to like catch their first waves. There are slots available to register into because they can't just kind of go, whoever shows up on the day gets a spot. I think they probably have like some Pilates or yoga stuff going down.
They also have that.
They have like an ice bath session where you get to like talk through the whole process of that, like what the physical and mental aspects of that are. But yeah, definitely if you're interested in attending and you haven't already been a part of this, check out Seize the Day on Surfing Australia. There will be a website for it as well. And make sure that you register for what you're interested in doing, because if you just show up on the day, then you're going to be able to fully take a seat and listen to some great talks and watch the other stuff happening. But the likelihood is that based off of the numbers they had last year, roughly 15,000 people that attended, their expectations are even more this year. They've got some great government funding as well from the New South Wales government, that you might miss out on the opportunity to actually take part in a lot of the activities. So make sure that you get in early, put your name down on what you're interested in doing.
Yeah, great point. And keeping our Australia theme focused at the moment, last time we were recording, Shan, Tropical Cyclone Alfred was like just about to hit.
You were about to endure it.
I was about to endure it. The surfing had already been done. But in that time, we saw some amazing surfing. Some incredible Kira had been had. Sorry, I don't know where I was going with that, but Kira was incredible. Pretty much every single wave on the southeast coast of Queensland, and then the north bit of New South Wales just got absolutely incredible waves from the cyclone Alfred, and we saw some standouts from that, Shan.
Yeah, talking surfing standouts prior to the cyclone actually, touching down. Ellie and Piper Harrison, who surprisingly are not related. Ellie's from Victoria, Piper's from the Gold Coast, had some absolutely outstanding waves. I mean, we're talking like, big, meaty sections, solid barrels, some great turns connected as well, as Mila Coco Brown and Liliana Bowery as well.
Yeah, we saw Liliana Bowery just recently featured on the We Shouldn't Be Friends podcast hosted by Nick Carroll and Hannah Anderson, and talking about her experiences out in Kira. And there were some epic waves. There was one I saw actually before, listening and actually seeing it, I'm motioning with my hand because I'm going to talk about reels. Like I saw a reel cut on Instagram, finally got there, of Liliana, Nick, and Hannah talking about this, and Liliana talking about how she was like racing, and this guy just like dropped in on her, and she's like, hey. And he looks back and then just like keeps going, and there's the footage from it, and she's just like, oh man. But it was Kira was crazy for that. There were so many people out there. There was so many jet skis out there too, people doing like step offs, people doing paddle ins. And I'm so glad that we got some epic footage of some of these women that we're talking about right now. I mean, it was, especially from Ellie, I think is what I personally have seen the most of. And I was so impressed by the beautiful surfing that we got to see take place on beautiful waves.
Yeah, absolute standouts of the entire scene. Yeah, very cool. So many of those clips are shared on their personal Instagrams, but also basically if you follow any surf media, you would have just seen this stuff dropping in all over the place over the last couple months, which has been really exciting to see. That said, back to Liliana, as you mentioned, she's had this new edit that's been released with Billabong. It is a 7-minute edit, a quiver of 4 boards, mostly filmed in Indonesia, and she covers longboarding all the way through to riding a long twin into deep, heavy barrels on a thruster. So a great variety, and you really showcasing how well-rounded she is as a surfer to be able to master different waves on different kinds of equipment.
I love edits that incorporate a variety of quiver and boards and waves. That for me gets me excited and stoked. And I thought it was a beautiful depiction of that she did.
Well, continuing on the edit conversation, and an edit very different from that of Liliana is one that Lakey Peterson has dropped. It's more of a kind of a short film. It's called Making Waves. It's 28 minutes long. You've likely also seen, the advertisements or even gotten to see this film already as it's been out since the start of the month. Made by Morgan Masson from the filming perspective. It's all black and white, and it mostly tells the story of her competitive surfing journey, talking to a lot of her friends and family around her home in Santa Barbara, which is great to get those insights from the people just that have known her and have watched her journey develop as a competitive surfer across her entire career. Really incredible surfing, as well as some of those conversation bits that came out.
Yeah, two things. One, Morgan Masson is a beautiful storyteller, and the shots that he gets are always really beautiful. I remember us talking about the edit he made with Malia. From memory, I think it was just like called Malia, and that was really beautiful as well. And 2, I am such a sucker for like sport documentaries. Not that this not that we're labeling this a documentary. It's more of a short film, but getting to hear about the rise, and as well as like the things that you see a successful athlete go through on the back end, in terms of self-doubt, or, I know she talks about, her not qualifying for the Olympics and her trying to kind of like push through that, and then like stepping into her winning at J-Bay and the confidence that gave her, that reconfidence that gave her into her career was, I love getting to hear that from an athlete's perspective and from the people who went through that journey with them.
Yeah, I mean, those are really the 2 major takeaways, like her missing out on Olympic qualification, and then, getting that win on the CT in J-Bay following some time of really struggling post missing that Olympic qualification, just really speaks to kind of her rebirth, even as who she is as a competitor coming into like a later stage of her career. I loved it as well because it just featured so much good surfing from her in J-Bay, which is my favorite place in the entire world. It has the best waves. There's just absolutely no comparison to anything. And I know that Lakey has a really solid personal relationship with the community there, as well as with the waves. So it was really special to see that featured so much. 3
other edits we'd like to make note of here. One by Coco Cairns called Rose Red Raw Rice. That's like a rose red raw rice. Rose red raw
nice job.
Rice. Yeah,
I was surprised you got that first round.
I know. I thought we were going to have to re-record that. Well, maybe we still should have. But anyways, Rose Red Raw Rice. Going. It's a 4-minute self-edited clip from 2 sessions that she's had, one in Sri Lanka and one in Snapper. Another one to mention, Shan, is a 4-minute edit as well by Lehani Zorik, or also known as At the Mini Shakas. And that is titled Lehani is Here. Yeah, it's a 4-minute self-edited clip. She's a 12-year-old surfer, and it's inspired by all the classic Andy Irons films with some kind of heavier music in it. And I just love that it's like filled with heaps of air attempts from her. There's one really solid one landed at the end. Just kind of, heaps of good shortboarding clips. But from this 12-year-old taking on a little bit of like a Katie Simmers flair within the self-edit, the music chosen, and even just some of the bright flashing graphics and changes in between things. So that was a really fun edit to see from Lehani. And then the final one that we wanted to mention today is a Sophie Fletcher 5-minute piece on starting Sophie Fletcher Designs. Sophie is a competitive surfer, has, had heaps of time on the qualifying series. I think she's from Phillip Island. She's definitely from Victoria. And she has a business. She's an artist, and she's got like this whole, she's kind of making some clothing, doing some designs on clothing, but mostly her product is sticker sales. And I see her stickers on surfboards. I see her stickers on cars, just some really cool, cute designs. And sweet to see that you can learn more about Sophie through her latest edit around Sophie Fletcher Designs. And she's currently kind of doing the market run across markets in Australia and really trying to promote her name and stuff. And she's just a great surfer to follow along with. Well, Lucy Small, thank you so much for coming on the Double Up once again. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Today, we've got you on specifically in the film chat to talk about your newest film being released in a couple of weeks, maybe 10 days, called Ceibo, which trails your journey with Patch of Light and Maddie Meddings through Ecuador. So that's really exciting. Thanks so much for coming on to chat about that. Before we get into that, though, let's talk quickly about Noosa, because you've just come down from Noosa Fest, an event that you maybe weren't supposed to surf in, and then you ended up being allowed to enter the draw anyways. So let's just dive straight into that with how Noosa went for you.
Yeah, Noosa, the waves there was massive swell a few weeks ago from Cyclone Alfred, but so typical, like it was basically flat by the time I arrived. But it ended up being so good. Like there was a little bit of a hoo-ha a few months ago where the Noosa Mal Club tried to do some maneuvers to stop me from entering because of a bit of advocacy I had done around prize money in relation to them a couple of years ago, that they didn't want me at the event. But after some media attention on that, they ended up letting me in. So, and I was kind of going up there, was feeling a bit like, oh, what's the vibe going to be, but I feel like enough time had passed that it was actually really chill and everyone was really nice and it was all good. It felt like a really good outcome. But in terms of the contest, I bombed, unfortunately. But it was really good. Like, it was so nice having so many internationals there. It was the second LQS qualifier for the Australia region. So it was the decider of who's going to get onto the World Longboard Tour. And my close friend Kira Molnar got her spot, so that was awesome. She's like, my first choice would have been me, but she would have been my second choice. So
great. Second choice.
I was pretty happy about that.
That's so sweet. Yeah, as far as other Noosa results go, Tolly White, who already has a wild card onto the World Longboard Tour for the WSL side of things, she took out the win for the women's logger alongside of Dea Natasha with a second place. Malia Iligan won the LQS and Kira got second, but because Malia is from the US, she's not an Australian regional surfer or an Oceania surfer. She was not able to obviously get a qualifying spot for this region, so that's gone to Kira, which is sick. Emma Pierre won the high pro division with Star Delia in second. And then in the juniors or the under 18 girls, Cash Hoover took out the win, which is awesome. And Luana Matthias comboed all other 5 finalists in the under 15s to take out the win this year. So I feel like the Grom crew is just, they've come out very strong, and we'll see how that factors into women competing like you in the next few years when they start to surf in the opens.
Yeah, Luana is so good, and she's got amazing style. So it's so cool seeing her competing and surfing and doing really well. And she's definitely, one to watch. She's got a great drop knee. Yeah.
Love that. Well, glad to hear that everything went kind of well enough at Noosa, even though the surf was small, and that seems to be the vibe at Noosa Fest most years. Occasionally it's good enough to actually run at the points, but it's usually down the groins or something. That aside, the main reason we wanted to chat to you today is to talk about your new film coming out called Ceibo. How do you pronounce that? How do you spell it? Is it an Ecuadorian word, and what does it mean? Let's start there.
Yeah, so thanks, Shannon. Ceibo, it's spelled Ceibo, and it is the name of a tree. So there's these big, beautiful, like the sort of might be known as the tree of life. They're like this really big cottonwood tree that they're actually all over the world, and they have different names wherever they are. Their scientific name is Ceiba, but in Ecuador they're called Ceibo, and they have this their kind of spiritual significance. They're thought to connect the afterlife with this one, and they hold a lot of water, and they have really relevance to Patch's life, who is the kind of main protagonist of the film. So that is what that word is.
Amazing. Well, tell us more about the film. How did the idea come up? I know for you and for Maddie Meddings, who's the filmer, this is the second film you guys have worked on after Yama, which was released a couple of years ago. How did this come together for you to, choose to work alongside Apache, to choose to have Ecuador as the feature in your film?
Yeah, so Maddie and I released Yama in 2023, and neither of us had worked on a long form project like that before. So it was a very trial and error process, but it was so fun. And as soon as we put the film out, we were like, okay, want to use everything that we've just learned to make another film together. And I hadn't met Patcha in person at that time, but I had been following her journey online, and she had been sharing about how she had kind of reconnected with her roots in Ecuador, and she was on this quest for identity, and it sounded really interesting. And then actually I met Patcha at a Yama screening.
Oh, and, amazing. I didn't realize that.
And I just kind of thought it would be so cool to do a project together. And then actually a few weeks later, we were doing, it was the Kira Classic, which I was on the Double Up about previously, but it was when we had all of the girls filling that mixed division.
There's always some controversy when we have you in the conversation. Noosa this time, and Kira Longboard Classic before.
And so when I was trying to recruit the people, I did an Instagram call out looking for people to enter with me. The first person to get in touch about it was Patcha, and so we just kind of connected and became friends. And she was really keen to do something that shared some of Ecuador. And Patcha's story is really interesting. She was born in the Ecuadorian Andes. Her mom is her dad is Ecuadorian, her mum is German Australian. And so she lived for the first few years of her life, totally off grid in this forest in the mountains, no electricity, using water from the river, that type of vibe.
Yeah.
And then, and then her mum and her brother moved back to Australia when she was little, and she grew up in Iluka on the New South Wales North Coast, and then on the Gold Coast. And she grew up to become a professional surfer. She was doing the Pro Junior and the QS and surfing under the Australian flag. But a few years ago, just everything kind of changed. She decided to stop competing. She left her major sponsor. And then her father, who was still in Ecuador, passed away. And so it sparked this journey to go and discover her heritage and learn about who she is. She'd kind of been back and forth to Ecuador a few times over her childhood, but couldn't speak Spanish, didn't really know that side of who she was. And so the last few years has been really learning about all that. So the film centers on Pacha and sharing that story, but we kind of, rather than just doing a single narrative, which would probably be a much more simple thing to do, but we wanted to make sure that in all the locations that we were filming in, that we had someone from that place to show us the place. And so that's what we did. So so it's Patra and I on this road trip around Ecuador on a surf trip.
So fun.
But then I know, it was the best trip. But then there's 4 other women who are major parts of the story. So we rock up to a new location and meet up with someone who then
you're kind of going from one woman to the next in your journey.
Yeah. And one of them, I mean, they were all so amazing. Like when I watch back each of their interviews, I'm just like, can't believe we had the opportunity to talk to these people. But one of the main characters is Mimi Barona, who is basically Ecuador's most decorated surfer. And she has this crazy story. She grew up in Montanita, which is Ecuador's main surfing town. And for her first international competition, it was in Panama, and she had enough money from a sponsor that gave her enough money to travel to the event. But she wanted her brothers to come with her. And so that meant they didn't have enough money for a hotel. They only had enough money for them to get there and to buy food. And so they slept on the beach in front of the comp. And she was 16, and her 2 brothers were just staying up all night being the bodyguards while she slept. And they all did really well in the contest. I think one of the brothers made the final. She made the final. They had a really good event, and that was the first time Ecuador had really been represented internationally, making the final, that type of thing. And so that basically sparked her career, and she has just worked so hard over the years to be an ambassador for Ecuadorian surfing, up until the point that she went to the Tokyo Olympics in 2020. And she qualified. She didn't have one of the spots that they give to countries where they don't have a lot of representation. She got her spot, which is
she fully qualified through ISAs.
And she absolutely rips. But we also, when we were there interviewing her, it was 3 months after her brother Israel, who she's done all of her competitive career with, who she was so close with, that he had passed away really suddenly. So she shares what she was going through at that time. And I feel like I got tears in my eyes now just thinking about it. It was so emotional, but it was also amazing because she was so beautifully open about it. She was really telling us so much of what she's been dealing with. And then also she was just so fun still. I was like, you're going through the hardest time of your life, but she was just so fun to be around. And it was awesome. And then we went and surfed the Galapagos Islands, and I was snorkeling with white-tip sharks. And we also went to the Amazon rainforest. So a really big part of the film is not actually in the surf. We spent a lot of time in the mountains and in the forest, and the Amazon is beautiful. We were staying with an Indigenous community there, and a woman called Elizabeth Verkina Swanson Andy was our local guide, and she was sharing some of the kind of struggles of her community that are there's people in the Amazon live along the rivers. They're this beautiful network that bring life to the communities everywhere. They depend on them for their gardens and fish and everything. But so many of them are affected by mining now. And so the Rio Napo, which is the river that she lives alongside, is being poisoned by heavy metals from upstream gold mining. and it's never been like that before. So people don't really know what to do, like whether they're getting made sick or what's going to happen and what the future is. So, and again, it was really like it was really awful. It was heartbreaking, but also we just had the best time. We were like whitewater rafting with like 10 girls on the river in the pouring rain. It was awesome. And like, yeah, Elizabeth was so beautifully open about everything and shared so much of her community with us. And yeah, it was just such a crazy trip. And then it was so cool to relive it all through the edit. And now to be able to share it is amazing.
Wow. You're such a good storyteller, Lucy. Like even just tracking with you just now, I'm like, my brain's like going through what I think it will look like, but I have no idea because I haven't seen the film or been there yet. But yeah, it sounds really beautiful, like a really beautiful story that crosses different people's like personal journeys mixed in also with that environmental impact side of things that as surfers, we just naturally care so much about because we care about the ocean, and we're like even paddling around or walking down the beach and you see trash and you're like, oh man, okay, like let's, do a little pickup on the way back to the car or whatever it is, like grab that trash in the water, shove it into the sleeve of your wetsuit, make sure it gets into a bin by the end of the day. So I feel like naturally these two kind of like worlds of surfing and storytelling of the people that you've met in Ecuador, as well as that environmental impact, sound like that they will just fit together so well. And I'm so excited to get eyes on this film finally, especially knowing how long you guys have been putting some time into. So talk to us about how that's going to work. Your world premiere and your Australian tour is coming up very shortly.
Yeah, so we are having the global premieres on the 8th of April in Sydney. And then we're doing a second one on the Northern Beaches a few days later. And then we're heading up the coast to Yamba, Gold Coast, Byron, Torquay, and then also over to Perth and back to my hometown of Denmark, which is going to be so good because it's population 5,000, and I feel like I'm doing like homecoming tour. Like that event is like the tickets are selling the best out of every event.
That's amazing.
I'm really excited for that. And then so Patra and I are going to be doing the Australian tour. Patra's going to be on the East Coast and then with me. And then I'm flying over to the UK to start the UK tour with Maddie.
Sick.
We're having the UK premiere in London, and then we're going to be in Bristol and Newquay, and we're going all over the place. So that's going to be awesome. And Maddie and I we never showed Yama together because we were both in different places the entire time. So it's going to be so nice to be able to show it together. And the global premiere is going to be good, Shannon, because we've got a great MC lined up.
Oh, hey. Can't wait. Trying to decide on my outfit. It's going to be so fun. No, I'm so excited. So Sydney premiere is happening in Paddington on the 8th of April. That'll be the first chance for the public to get eyes on. There's tickets available. There's a lot of seats in the theater, which is really fun. And then from there, we'll make sure, Lucy, to put into our show notes for this episode the links to your website, to Ceibo Film, and for how everyone can get tickets and find out, the closest location specifically around Australia. And then from there, as your global tour starts to explode, where else people can go and see the film.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, I'm just so excited to show everyone because I feel like, I don't know, I guess it's just trying to use surf films as a medium to communicate something that matters. And it's an all-girl cast and an all-girl crew, and just basically Maddie and I just dreamed up what we wanted to do, and then we just did it. And throughout the last 18 months of working on the film, it's like a process of going, do you think we're allowed to do this? And then it's like, oh, well, we're in charge, so yes.
We own this, so we can do anything we want.
And been so beautiful collaborating with Patra too. She's such a bright spark in any room, and it's been so fun becoming friends. And so thankful to her for opening up and sharing her story and bringing us to Ecuador. And it's been amazing.
So good. Well, Lucy, I'm so proud of you again for just all of the things that you're continuously accomplishing, including another new film dropping. Can't wait to get eyes on it. Thanks so much for coming on the Double Up today. And I will see you at the world premiere on April 8th. Yay.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks for having me. See you then.
Well, heading into contest corner now, we've got a QS wrap followed by our kind of brief of Portugal, as well as discussion that we hinted on at the start of this episode, Rachel. Heading into the QS wrap up, though, we know that the Challenger Series is right around the corner. It's already the end of March, which is also completely insane that it's basically almost April and all of the things are happening very quickly this year. But Challenger Series kicks off in June. And so we know that globally, the different regions with the qualifying series are starting to wrap up. So today in this episode, we're going to touch on the Oceania region wrapping up, which includes like Australia, New Zealand, etc., as well as the Asia region. And we know the qualifiers for the women that are heading into the Challenger Series, some for the very first time, some as repeat. I was going to say assassins, ready to try and take out some heats and get themselves onto the championship tour.
Yeah, well, we did just see the Phillip Island QS 3000 take place. We saw Sophie McCulloch take her second win on the QS in a row, and this comes after her breaking her back in a session at the box last year in Margaret River. So I am so happy to see her not just back in surfing, like at the very least, but so awesome to see her stepping back into a success.
Incredible to see her get a couple of wins on the qualifying series this year. And I'm sure that, you know, heading through the rest of the year, looking at rehab and everything, she's going to be just getting stronger and stronger. And these wins are going to give her a huge boost to really continue pushing that competitive side of things. That said, we now have 3 new Australia/Oceania Challenger Series qualifiers to join Sierra Kerr. Sierra already took out the regional title and is now being joined by Oceana Rogers, Jolly Stokes, and Willow Hardy. So that's very exciting to see.
Looking over to the Asian region and where they're at with their Challenger Series qualifiers, we have Nanaho Suzuki, who took out the Asian regional title for the second time now. We have Anan Matsuoka, who is returning to the Challenger Series for the third time now, and longtime junior standout Mariah Ikeda is joining the Challenger Series for the first time.
Well, an interesting thing to note, Rachel, when it comes to both of these regions is that there's been big turnover in the types of surfers qualifying for the Challenger Series out of the region, where we're seeing the older surfers, those veterans that we have been tracking with for so many years on the qualifying series, on the Challenger Series, even on the championship tour, who weren't able to find their Challenger Series qualification out of this year's QS, being replaced by those younger surfers in both the Australia region and the Asian region.
Yeah, surfers like Philippa Anderson and Paige Harrop, who we're not seeing on the tour anymore. Gianna Rogers at 20, and all the other 3 are 18 years old. So that is a really big discrepancy in that turnover and this new wave of generation really coming up.
Yeah, I mean, we talked
Changing
about
with the
that.
guard.
Yeah, exactly. We've been seeing that specifically, like really extreme on the championship tour, but we're also seeing those sorts of results and that changing of the guard filter through down from the Challenger Series and the qualifying series as well. Nanaho and Mirai, also they're replacing Sarah Wakita and Amuro Suzuki as the qualifiers for the Asian region from last season. And both Sarah and Amuro were talking a bronze medalist for the Olympics, and Amuro and just really outstanding surfers for that region for a long amount of time. It's surprising to see them not in that mix, but it's also really exciting to see some of that, those younger surfers getting those opportunities now to start growing their campaigns towards hopeful qualification one day to come between Nanaho and Mirai.
Absolutely. Well, Shan, taking this conversation into a more Portugal focus, we just saw the third CT of the season wrap up. We saw Caroline Marks take out the win against Gabriela Bryan, who joined her in the final.
Yeah, it was great to see competitive surfing return to the ocean. We're all really big fans of that. So that was just really exciting to see, all of the pros and cons that come with ocean competitions as opposed to the wave pool. It was interesting to kind of watch it unfold from a conditions perspective. They had a big storm that rolled through. There was, some kind of flares of good surfing for the women as far as not their actual surfing is concerned, but when it comes to waves. But for the most part, they were surfing pretty small conditions throughout the entire window. I know that it seemed like a pretty challenging forecast to nail as far as actually running through an entire event, men and women combined. And so the women kind of getting some crazy little beach break conditions, really rippy, lots of windy days, and fairly challenging to pick out like the diamond in the rough throughout the entire event.
Yeah, I think it's not surprising to hear, though, with those conditions, Katie Simmers was actually having such a good time for her, looking at it like it was Oceanside Harbor or Oceanside Pier, very familiar conditions for her. And I think had she not been too patient in her quarters against Aaron, things were looking good. But I think that's where we saw slowness or the patience that ended up getting the best of the surfers who got knocked out in their respective heats.
Yeah, so kind of talking through some of those standouts throughout the entire event. Of course, Caroline Marks taking out the win, huge for her in her campaign towards a second world title. This is her best start to a season looking back since 2019. So 5-6 years on, she's really coming out with a bang. She's looking pretty sharp in her surfing, which is awesome, especially when it comes to like the heats that she's making it through and her consistency to be making it to the ends, the kind of sharp points of competition. Also for her heading into El Salvador, she is the back-to-back defending champion. So that's going to be that event's already kicking off in maybe 10 days from now from our recording date, not from our release date. And so she's going to be feeling really good coming off of this one in Portugal. Especially, I feel like considering, maybe Rach, this is more to throw to you as someone who competes so often and has had so much success. Caroline's performance in this event wasn't exceptional. Like I'm not from, the scores that were coming through from the heats that she drew. I feel like she wasn't in really any of the kind of intense battles. And she just kind of found herself walking away just narrowly ahead of, the other surfer, even when it came to the final between her and Gabby. The scores, their heat totals were like both in that 7-point range or so. So it was clearly very challenging conditions, but she was also kind of struggling to find the best scores out of the waves that were offered to her. I know there was also one wave in the final. It was like maybe the only left that she had on her forehand, where the wave quality was easily the best quality wave of the entire heat. And she was only able to surf it to a 4. So kind of taking into consideration like a couple of those things for her to still walk away with a win and come out on top, now keeping herself well in the rankings, how does it feel to be a surfer in that position, knowing that she maybe left something else out there that she would have loved to really take hold of really intensely within her personal performance, but nonetheless walked away with a victory?
That's a good question. I think wins feel the best when it kind of is you're put under pressure and you do rise to the occasion. I'd say that for heat wins, but like an event win is an event win, and I think as an athlete, if I were her coach, something maybe if that is still something that's like important to note in their game, like they can, I've had events where I've won before and then walked away and gone, yeah, but like I got not lucky, but I got gifts here and there. Like that was kind of fortunate timing that wave came when I had priority or whatever. There were mistakes that I made that didn't hinder me as much as they potentially could have in identifying those. So I think to your point, Shan, like walking away before the next event and going, okay, I'm taking the confidence that I was able to win the whole event, get a CT win. But there's things on the table that I want to continue to work through. I mean, she's heading into El Salvador where she does have back-to-back wins there. So I think that now she'd actually, off the back of a win, be walking into feeling pretty confident.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting to see how she goes in that event. Molly Picklum, another standout of the event. She has made at least the semifinals, Rach, in all 3 events so far this year.
Yeah, what a strong start to the year. An impressive kickoff, 2 semis and a final that she's had so far in a very diverse set of waves, being pipe, Abu Dhabi, and Portugal. I think that is showing, extreme versatility and something that is worthwhile recognizing. Mm-hmm. So that's an awesome start for her. Point. I think she'd be feeling really good then walking forward to El Salvador and obviously to Australia after that. So feeling good on the rankings, being, I think, post third event and not even having to sit worried whatsoever about mid-season cut is a really strong place to be in, because you can continue to work on solidifying those spots for the top 5. Obviously, it's still pretty early in the season to be talking about top 5 by any means, but we're well within that conversation of who's looking good or not so good for that mid-season cut. And to be that not even crossing your mind and just focusing on winning events to stay at the very top is a really, really strong place to be looking at. In that exact same position is Katie Summers. And obviously she got knocked in the quarters this event, but regardless, with her strong results, was actually able to still maintain holding that yellow jersey.
Yeah, great for Katie when it comes to, the rest of the season, wanting to back herself up with a second world title. If she can even just, the idea of heading into that final 5 conversation. I mean, we've got the mid-season cut still to talk about long before we get to any of that, but heading into that in that first place position is a huge bonus of things. So yeah, just I guess my last thought on that when it comes to like conditions and stuff is both for Molly, she could have easily made her semi into the final. It was Caroline that took her out by, less than a point. They both had like 4s and 3s on the board as their top scores. Katie as well got stuck waiting for a wave in the quarter against Erin, where she ended up losing out to Erin Brooks. Really interesting just to see some of those dynamics coming to play when the conditions are really challenging and when it really could kind of go anyone's way in those moments. And like priority decisions have a massive impact on the outcome of a heat. Holding on to it for too long, using it at the wrong times, trying for a wave that's just not going to stay open, or you luck into a wave that actually gives you something for a 2 or maybe a 3-turn combination is really impressive. So coming out of that matchup with Katie, Erin Brooks ends up taking out the win. Of course, it was then Erin versus Gabby in the semifinals for whichever of those two would match up against Caroline into the final. But important note is that Erin now has Katie in a 2-0 win as far as head-to-head matchups, while Katie holds on to that yellow jersey. Erin Brooks is now currently holding on to that 6th place ranking on the CT.
Yeah, I know. I just said that it's probably, or it is too soon to actually be having that full final 5 conversation. But looking at Erin sitting right now in 6th, if she's able to boost herself into that final 5, finals this year is at Cloudbreak. And we know that last year, her first ever CT going in as a wild card, she was able to win. So I think she probably sees that finals location now being at Cloudbreak and would be feeling really good with that. She just needs to give herself the shot to get there. And continuing this conversation around Erin, I think Erin and Gabby's semifinal, Shan, that you had touched on was probably the standout in terms of conversation or discourse that we're seeing post the event around who should have won that heat is been, pro Gabby, who did win the heat, versus pro Erin. It happened in the middle of the night for us here in Australia. So I went back and watched the replay after already knowing the result and after already, I hadn't fully known like the discourse yet, but was like, oh, okay, great. Yeah. Gabby won. Like, let's see how that heat went. And I was not expecting myself to sit in the camp and go, actually, I think Erin should have gotten the score. I think for me, if you've watched that heat, I think Erin's wave, so in defending that it should have been the score, she needed like a 6.4, 6.5. Gabby had a 6.5 in her score range already. And I think what we're seeing in comparison, and we've talked about this with Gabby, which we'll touch on more, is her power is unmatched right now on tour. She is so powerful. And so my pick going into that heat would be Gabby. I was like, Gabby's power is going to Erin's power, easily. I was so impressed with Erin's reading of the waves and her wave selection that I do think it actually made up for where she didn't have as much power in her turns. And obviously that's what Gabby was getting her scores from. But I think in terms of wave selection and some of the criticalness of the maneuvers on the size of wave in Erin's compared to Gabby, who had slightly smaller waves, but was really able to gouge the heck out of it. I think that's why we're seeing this conversation around it, which I really enjoy. I love hearing these conversations of why people thought, well, Gabby's power was unmatched. And even though it was a smaller wave, like that power is what should be getting the score, versus I was kind of looking maybe more at, I think Erin should have got it because I really appreciated her technique and her kind of all around, I guess, maneuver selection and wave positioning, maneuver positioning on her waves. So I thought Erin should have gotten it. Did you have a different, what do you think?
I think, yeah, I'm happy with Gabby having taken out the win. I think watching that, noting that it was ridiculously close and fully appreciating, like you said, the technique, some of the wave selection from Erin. I thought that Gabby, like the point of difference for me within that heat was going, okay, this is really challenging. This is really tight. They both had some little standout moments, and they both had moments where you're like, oh, I wish that wave just had been a little bit longer or had a little more steepness of face to it where they could really like kind of close the door solidly on the conversation. I am happy with Gabby having taken the win based off of the power in her surfing, and that she was able to just get maybe that ounce extra, which literally it was like by, less than like 0.5, 0.01 of the difference between her and Erin's scores on some of the waves. And so I feel like just that little tiny extra nod goes to Gabby being able to just bring in that little bit of extra power, which comes from very good technique. Like to be able to have the power coming off of her top turns, it means that her bottom turn lining up for it was very good to put her in that position in the first place. So I'm happy with that as a result. But I do love that it came just so close and that it was really one of those tight battles, like the heat of the event in the context of both of them surfing very sharp, both of them having waves let them down and also having waves that allowed them to just get enough to at least put sixes on the board instead of another heat of being like, okay, can I get more than a 3 out here? Like, how do we find more than a 3, which was really challenging across so many of the other heats within. Now, having said that around Gabby, like taking out Erin in that heat and it just being really like splitting hairs, I will go into this and say that Gabby was the standout surfer of the event. Of course, Caroline ended up taking out the win, but I think that across an entire event on the strength of her surfing, that it's Gabby that, there's been a big conversation around her surfing anyways and her power coming out of her Abu Dhabi heats into now Portugal. But yeah, I just think it's so cool to see where she's currently sitting. It's so good to see this newfound confidence as well, which we got to hear Rachel in one of the Portugal post heats.
Yeah, Abu Dhabi was such a confidence booster for me. I feel like pool events are so tricky. It's really an event where you have to focus on yourself and kind of just use your strengths to your advantages. And it was a really good reminder that my power surfing, it's one of the best, and as long as I keep doing that and sticking to what I know and doing my thing, then I'll be pretty good. I mean, Portugal is so hard and unpredictable, so also like adapting and just giving it my best every time I go out.
And you're no longer a rookie, but you also have not been on tour for as long as some of the women. How important is it for you to recognize that you needed that extra confidence booster?
Oh, it's so much. 4 years has gone by so fast. I can't even believe I'm saying that. I honestly still feel like a rookie sometimes, but I mean, yeah, I still have a lot more to give, and I feel like you're always learning, so just everything I've learned in these past 4 years, just putting it to use and not forgetting about it helps me. So yeah, I'm excited for the future.
Yeah, and similar to what we talked about with Caroline, Shan, obviously walking into this next event off the back of a great result being for Caroline a win, she's walking into El Salvador, where she has won in the past. Gabriela Bryan coming off a second, and last year she also placed second at El Salvador. So it's a really I think we're going to continue to see her on this role because it's seeming like it's continuing. The opportunities there for her to continue to build upon each result and increase that confidence. So I think we're seeing Gabriela sit on the precipice of her climbing up the rankings and really finding her stride and getting into a great rhythm, potentially going into later of the season. And we're just seeing these initial signs of it. Obviously, initial signs being an amazing result of a second place, but even just in the way what we heard with her in that post heat and how she's feeling from a mental perspective in her surfing, I think I love hearing that. And I love the confidence in her voice of saying, I am the most powerful, or walking in as like the most powerful women on tour right now and really trying to own that space. And seeing that within her surfing is really cool to see.
Yeah, it's super, super impressive. I'm excited to see Gabby on tour for the rest of the season. That said, a couple other things we just wanted to tap into as far as like a wrap up on Portugal. Joanne DeFay obviously, decided to surf in the event. We weren't sure if that was going to happen or not because she announced her pregnancy just post Abu Dhabi. I think it was right after the event. And I can't remember how far along she is, but she must be in that like 4-month kind of window, which means she's got a little bit of a belly. She's showing a bit. Paddling is going to be a little more uncomfortable, which I can speak to firsthand now. And she'll be feeling like, quite different in what she's able to do as an athlete. Love the fact that she paddled out of Portugal. She also made it into the quarters at around 16 weeks pregnant, which is so fantastic. That said, she's now out for the rest of the season and just gets to enjoy a different stage of life as they prepare for their first little child. And that gives Nadia Arostarbe from Spain the opportunity. We should be seeing her surf at every other pre-cut event this season. I don't see why that wouldn't be the case.
Yeah. And speaking of other veterans, Shan, we are seeing Tati kind of just, I don't know. Well, actually, I don't know what we're seeing happen right now. And she's sitting towards the bottom of the rankings at the moment. And this is where she needed to have a result after Pipe and Abu Dhabi results. And I think walking into Portugal with past performance being any indication, hasn't made it lower than a semis and has won this event in the past. And she got knocked out in round of 16. So a really interesting just observation to be had there.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to see like both her and Sally currently sitting essentially equal last on tour. So if the cut was happening now, we'd be losing two of the, most standout veterans on the tour.
And sorry, I'll correct myself there. I said she hasn't placed better, or she lost a round of 16. She actually hasn't placed better a round of 16 throughout this year, but lost in the elimination round in Portugal. So I think maybe an indication that we're starting to see her maybe even get into her head more and more as the results pan out.
Two veterans who are having a much better start to the year, Lakey and Tyler. They're the only two vets currently sitting in the top 10, where all three rookies are sitting, which is pretty wild. Along with the rest of the tour's kind of newer faces, aside from Luana Silva and Betty Luce Curra-Johnson, who also have yet to make it past the round of 16 this season. So it's a real change up when it comes to the women's tour and what we're looking at. Of course, we're only 3 events in. We've got plenty more to go before the midseason cut now, being that the number of events is larger on tour this year. And there's, I think, 7 events, right, post-cut. So there's still 4 more to run through before we have those official results. But at the moment, it's really favoring that newer pack of surfers as opposed to, some of those veterans or those that have now been on tour for a couple seasons, but maybe just are struggling to really find their footing.
Yeah, well, I guess time will tell with that one, Shan, and we will be keenly watching. Now, that leads us into the discussion that I know both of us are looking forward to having in and around Portugal for our listeners that follow us also on at the double up, at the .double.up, little plug there. Thought I may as well. We had an awesome discussion back and forth with quite a few listeners on some comments that we heard in the booth, Shan, that kind of, I think, I'm not going to say to the untrained ear, but like we are keenly listening for this stuff, and comments that are not innately bad in any way, but do make us go like, actually, are those the ways we should be encouraging and supporting women surfing? That flagged for us. And so we wanted to put it out to the listeners to see, hey, does this flag or land? Where does this land with you guys? Are we being overly sensitive or like searching for this stuff? Or is this kind of a sentiment that is shared with our listenership? And I think it's safe to say it definitely was. So Shane, I'm going to throw it to you to kick us off with this one.
All right. So Rachel, we've got a few kind of places that we may or may not end up going with this conversation. Like you said, we've been having it in a lot of surfs and hikes over the last couple of weeks, or the last week that we had together. But what initially spurred our conversation on and was a quote that Stab put up in one of their articles around the event. It was from one of the men commentating in the booth, Strider Wazalewski, who said after Gabby had done just this incredibly impressive frontside turn, he said, Gabriela Bryan can do a better frontside hack than half the men on tour. Now, Rachel and I, in seeing that comment or, kind of like seeing it flag there on Stab and listening to it from the booth conversation, our immediate response to that is, so she's only as good as half the men on tour. Rather than going, Gabby's power is better than any, she is the best, and just rating her as that. So we decided to take this to a poll to our audience on the Double Up, and this is the poll that we put up. We said, is it time to stop rating women's performances against men? You had two options to click on. First said, enough with the comparisons already, which Rachel and I, unsurprisingly to our entire audience, would stand on that side of things. And the other was saying a compliment is a compliment. Like Strider's given her a massive compliment by saying that her frontside hack is better than half the men on tour. And that's kind of more into like a power conversation or something maybe. Okay, so the results to that poll, 78% of those that clicked into it, I don't know, what do you say, contributed their thoughts, said enough with the comparisons already.
Voted.
22%
polled.
Voted. Yeah, voted. Oh yeah, polled. Those polled in the poll. 22% said a compliment is a compliment. So by far the majority saying enough with the comparisons already. Let men's sport stand as men's sport. Let women's sport stand as women's sport is essentially what, our kind of point is with that. Couple key takeaways now from the overall poll. As it was. 16% of the votes were from men. Men made up 10% of the votes that went for enough with the comparisons already response. And 50% of the votes for a compliment is a compliment were male voters. So more men chipping into the conversation that just, saying, well, what Strider said is great. Where far more women contributing 90% of the votes towards let's separate this and women's sport should just be celebrated as women's sport. 90% of that coming from a female audience.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting take or just even just seeing that breakdown. I'll start this by saying, obviously, Strider was giving, he wasn't trying to diss her in any sort of way.
Yeah, totally.
I think where it flagged for us is man, is it not even is it time? Because, we probably should have never been in this space, but is it time for us to finally start having these conversations about what does that compliment actually look like? And does being compared to the men and saying wow, you're as good as a guy. And Shen, this is actually a conversation we had with Dave Proden on our last episode that we just released. Yeah. So it was kind of funny timing.
Wild timing. Yeah.
It was. We had that. And then 4 days later, this was said on the WSL broadcast that our conversation on that episode was, man, we're finally at a place where it's it's no longer the ultimate compliment to say wow, you're surfing like a guy. And growing up, that was the ultimate compliment. And I think that is counterintuitive for promoting women's surfing. I think saying hey, you're surfing like the best women out there, or you are the best woman out there, or being able to look at your woman surfer idols, as a young surfer coming up and wanting to surf like them. And not just trying to be a different version of the guys that you see on tour, and I'm talking about that from a perspective of like a young girl coming up, is a really great thing that we're at now, like surfing, women surfing. We spent a lot of time talking on our last episode of saying like women surfing is finally in a place within society, within our industry, within journalism, that it is being celebrated and stands on its own. It doesn't have to be through the lens of how does it look though compared to what we're seeing on the men's side. So before we dive into where those actual results, obviously you broke down the voters of the results and everything. I think just framing up the argument in and of itself is that we strongly believe that women's surfing is and should be just compared within the realm of women's surfing, just as we don't look at men's surfing or John or Ethan Ewing and say like, oh, this is how his turn or his performance compared to a Katie Simmers. And I think it's okay to recognize the differences between women and men surfing. Like we've always tried to pretend that there's not differences, I think, because we've been trying to validate women surfing as being good enough because it always is through the lens of men surfing. But I think it's okay to say like there are differences between men's and women's bodies and the power that we're going to see out of that and so forth. And that's not a diss or a negative thing. And this comment of saying, well, she can do a better frontside hack than half of the men on tour. Well, that may be true, but it's not about what she can do in comparison to the men. It's that she's doing the best frontside hack of all the women right now.
Yeah, I think that's, at least for me, that's been kind of the main point of this conversation all along, is that women's surfing should be standing on its own and should be celebrated as its own thing, rather than that comparison like you brought up, a John or an Ethan. They're just being called the best. So John is the best in the world. Why does Steph Gilmore now need to be called the best in comparison to, or Gabby Bryan right now as the most powerful female surfer on the planet? Why does she then have to be compared to a man rather than just being able to be called the best? And because this comparison has continuously existed due to societal norms, history, I mean, we're talking thousands of years of cultural normalities that have pinned us against each other rather than allowed us to just be like, let's celebrate. And it doesn't even have to, like, the comparison doesn't have to be there in any way, because if we're talking about a woman and we're saying she's the best of her field. And if we're talking about this guy, we're saying he's the best in his field. Where I could also go into having a conversation about where Steph is better than so many of the men, because her flow and her grace and her timing and all the things is so much farther above what we're seeing on that side. But rather than having to continually feel like we're dissecting things in that comparison, it should just be like, well, of course, we're talking about them also in the context of their field of their peers. We're not going, let's take them out of their field of their peers. Men and women aren't competing against each other in surfing. We're not seeing women having to surf a couple heats at the opening round against the men. Therefore, comparison comes into it. Why do we need to bring that comparison in at any point in the conversation if they're actually not peers? And when we talk comparison, the comparison should only involve the peers that they're surfing against. Like, we're not comparing, say, at a comp that I'm going to run or that we're running down the street next week, the Ocean Queen Classic in Winona. There's a juniors division and there's an opens division. There might be some juniors that will surf up into the opens. And so in that context, their surfing is going to be compared to the open women they're competing against. But otherwise, we're going to say this kid is the best, and she's obviously the best of the junior field because she's competing in juniors. And then there's the best of the opens field because they're competing against their peers in that context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think it's that constant need to, because subconsciously, or just like the way society and in our industry and society and sport and women's sport has always existed, is that we've just always seen men's surfing as the premier, as the top, as good as you could get. So constantly trying to qualify your performance against what the men are doing is what has been the norm. And so I'm not going to pin this against Strider right now. He was trying to say that as like a compliment, but I think it leads us into this conversation of saying, hey, but I think we should start this conversation saying enough with that. It's been long enough of us doing that. And actually, it's not helpful to the sport. It's not productive to the sport. It's also just not a valid comment or argument, because you're never looking at the men surfing and saying, well, how are they the best in comparison to the women's tour? And I think us in doing that with the women's tour is obviously that signifying, like I said before, that we always sit with the premier. The best you could do is be like a man in this sport. And to reference back to the conversation we had earlier this month, with Dave in our collab with the lineup, was like, I think we're seeing these and so explosive right when they come on tour, because they've been able to grow up in the last 5 years in a generation that's changed, in a society that's changed, and embrace them to be just athletes, not be like the athlete and the feminine model in order to qualify themselves to have a sponsorship or to be funded or promoted. And so we're seeing Katie, Sierra, Mila Coco Brown, all of these young girls right now that have spent serious time just actually on their craft, and they're coming onto tour as really incredible surfers. And I think they were able to be raised more. So obviously we're still having this conversation, so it hasn't changed, but raised more. I think that's the difference that we're seeing in that generation of going like, hey, women surfing, to be a women surfer is an incredible thing. It's not like oh yeah, that's like a fine thing, because like if you are a good enough woman surfer, you actually might be as good as like an average guy. It's like, it's not about that. Like for me as a woman, I love seeing what other women, those are my peers, those are my comparisons, those are what I'm striving to be like. And hey, it's kind of like, if you want to make a even broader comparison without the construct of like gender in it, like if I'm on a longboard versus shortboard, if I'm watching someone do a hack on a shortboard and I'm like, oh, well, like I'm not comparing the hack that I can do on a longboard to that. It's like I'm watching another longboarder out in the conditions and saying like, oh, how good are they? Like, what are they doing? What are they able to achieve out there? Like, wow, look at that they just read the wave and performed it like that. I'm not like comparing my surfing to a shortboarder out in those conditions. And so I think that's the same, but gets kind of a more difficult conversation, because the gender conversation is just so sport as well.
Yeah, I think in that context, I'm going to take us onto a slightly different vein quickly, but just because this conversation was spurred on by a comment made in the booth. Now, this in Portugal, this heat was happening with 3 male commentators sitting in the booth. There was no women in the conversation at all. And again,
I'll just add, Shan, no woman was actually had the opportunity to be part of the conversation, because not one woman was hired on the commentary team besides AJ, who was working on the sidelines, but her role then is like a sideline reporter, not a commentator within the booth. So it wasn't even just in specific that heat that we're talking. It was that was going to be no matter what.
Yeah, there were no female commentators hired. This is now year 3 that they haven't had any female commentators, booth commentators specifically hired for Portugal, which is just another thing that I could talk about in detail for a very long time. The last time there was a female commentator in the booth in Portugal, it was me. That was in 2022. I haven't had any work with the WSL since that season. After I reported something to HR, I have just been ghosted and haven't heard anything from them since. Not that they would admit that that's why I don't have work, but the timing lines up so perfectly that we can assume it's only because I reported on what I reported. Now, that said, at the time, I'm just going to give a little bit of context here before I continue with my previous thought. At the time in 2022, there was big conversation coming through from headquarters from WSL that because Portugal, it always runs in March, it's always around International Women's Month, which is, the reason that we did this collab with the lineup in the first place, was to celebrate women surfing during Women's History Month. Often the actual International Women's Day falls during the Portugal event. This year, it just happened to not fall within the actual window of the 10 days of the competition. But the WSL was pushing at that stage a few years ago to have, for this event specifically, a full female commentary team, which would mean 6 booth commentators plus the sideline commentator, because they always hire 7 commentators.
Mm-hmm.
So 7 women would be hired. Now, at that stage, it was a little bit like, that's the coolest idea. I was so encouraged to hear that that's where their mindset was heading, but also had to kind of raise the flag that they weren't capable of hiring 7 women, because I'm still the only qualified play-by-play in our sport that's a female. Every other play-by-play in our sport is a male. And most of that is because the women that have been working their way up through the lower ranked events, there are plenty of them. True Starling, Jess Grimwood. There's others from other regions that have been starting to fill in that role across the qualifying series. They are not being given that opportunity when it comes to their hiring positions on the Challenger Series, and no other woman has been hired into that position on the Championship Tour. So first off, WSL can't do that. They will have to hire a man on the team because they haven't allowed for the growth of female commentators to actually get to that place where, say, if I was actually hired, which is clearly not happening again, or, you know, at that stage a couple of years ago, they can't do that in the first place. But my point of that story in this tangent is that they were thinking through in that way. Hey, let's get more female voices in the booth. Like, this is awesome. Let's do that. The following year, 2023, no female commentators, just as female sideline reporter. And I'm not in any way bagging on a female sideline reporter. It just sits as a different role to being in the booth. And this is between play-by-plays and your color analyst, who's like a Felicity Palmatier, a Laura Enerver, Rachel, when you come and commentate with me. You're looking at former world championships, former tour surfers of an elite level that are going to sit and have that expertise to chip into the conversation. So 2023, 2024, now 2025, the WSL has chosen not to hire a single female to sit in the booth in Portugal. And it doesn't get picked up by anyone anywhere. Like, there's no conversation about it when there's just men chipping into the conversation. If there had been a flip, and let's say the WSL was putting forward a full female team, it would be like, it would literally hit news waves far outside of surfing, because it would be so monumental in sport that there was a full female commentary team, and that it was okay and awesome and normal to listen to women's voices contributing to their thoughts on sport, that it would boost their credibility and their integrity and their character as an organization massively when it comes to like gender support and equality for the industry. All of that said, sorry for a long tangent and rant about something that clearly this is my career and I feel passionate about.
Hey, don't apologize. This is our podcast. You're allowed to.
Okay, so on my soapbox, I'm now thinking through, back in the context of how we started this conversation, the poll results that we had. So only 10% of the poll results in favor of saying, basically, you know, enough with the comparisons, women's sport to be celebrated as women's sport, men's sport to be celebrated as women's sport. Gabby is the best. She's just the best. It doesn't need to be compared. Only 10% of that voice in that poll came from men. On the opposite vote, saying comparison is a comparison, take a compliment as a compliment, like, you know, Strider's comment, great compliment being thrown to her. Half of that, 50% of that vote came from men, which speaks to the fact that men and women across this kind of context are viewing these kind of situations very differently. That has to do, again, with social norms, cultural, like all of the different things historically that have shaped us into how we're viewing things. With the context now coming into a commentary position and a booth filled with men for an entire event, we are only going to hear from the opinions of that sort of mindset. And there are plenty of men in that conversation that I genuinely believe like love and celebrate women surfing, and I have a lot of respect for. There's also a lot of men in that context that I don't think care about women surfing, and they don't speak about it in a great way, or they've changed the way that they'll phrase things now because they know it's not good to say things in a certain way, but historically they haven't been actually good for women's sport in the kind of conversation they're having. Either way, and I'm not saying that like specifically about anybody in this context, but having had only male voices means that we're likely going to get that comparison conversation coming across a lot more. Where the moment you introduce a woman's voice into that, you're getting a woman's perspective on her peers. And that's going to change the type of tone and conversation that's coming out. And I think that's where the WSL needs to step up. They need to change their game, and they need to do a hell of a lot better at putting women in the booth, because we want to hear from the currents that are like, you know, the female greats of right now. And we want to be hearing from the female greats. I want to hear Pam Burge in the booth. Like, I want to hear her breaking down surfing the same that we're hearing male world champions. And we should be seeing that on an equal playing field. I brought this up in the conversation with the lineup. Another reason why I wanted to tap on it in this rate is because it kind of got flagged in that conversation as a little bit of like they're doing good because they're including women. But actually, like, if we're watching a whole lot of women surfing, we should be hearing from women every time women are in the booth. And I think that's going to also change the impact on a female audience. And I think that the WSL right now is not considering that a majority of their audience is female. We're talking young girls, we're talking women of our age, we're talking older women that are huge fans of the sport. And the impact of hearing comparison comments made on a consistent basis, rather than getting to hear any of the women in the booth having these conversations and critiquing or celebrating the women surfing as it is, it has a massive impact then on how those groms are thinking about themselves, on how women are thinking about themselves in this context. And the more the organization does to put women's voices as the forefront for where those thoughts can be, I think the much better that it is for all of us.
Yeah, that was really well said. I have a lot of things I'd like to respond to there. I think, you know, starting at that booth conversation. And I think we should be in a place where it's completely respectable and qualified to hear women talking about men's surfing, men's talking about women's surfing, women talking about women's surfing, men talking about men's surfing. Like they are, you know, the commentators that we're listening to them because they are qualified commentators, not because they are a man or a woman. And I think we innately just like trust a men's voice more in the commentary booth, which is why you would never bat an eye to see an entire men's commentary booth team hired. But it would be like so revolutionary to hear 7 women hired to talk about surfing. Like, I mean, that even flags for me. It's like, whoa, that's kind of crazy. Which then just like,
I'm like, wow, you guys were thinking about that at one stage?
Yeah, but I mean,
are
the fact
we
that
there
that's
yet? Like, yeah.
But we absolutely are, because we have women world champions. Well, totally. We have like a qualified women's journalists. You know, we're well past that. But the fact that that still flags in your head as crazy when it doesn't flag as the opposite, I think is an example of just how this conversation is still really gendered focused, and how we, you know, are just still very used to having that one or two woman, like listening to those women voices. And it's actually not about gender at all. It is. And I know that someone might hear that and say like, well, if it's not about gender at all, then like, why are you talking all about gender and having like 50% women and men in the booth? And I think to that, it is important that there are different experiences within surfing as a man and a woman. And that then leads us into this conversation about the lens in which men talk through surfing and experience surfing versus women. And that's what you were saying before, Shan, I think, or to tack on to what you were saying before, is like, if a woman was in the booth during a comment like that, whether she would have like called him out directly or not then, but like, I don't think the conversation would have gone that way at all. I think women talking about women surfing through their experience lens is a more authentic and real perspective to that, which I find interesting. Exactly. And I want to hear. I'll read this. I liked one of our listeners submitted this as their take to the poll. And she had said, so I'm definitely in the enough with enough comparisons camp, but your breakdown of the men's results on the previous slides has me thinking. Men, I'm generalizing, seem to only be able to frame things in the context of their own gendered experience. To them, comparisons of a woman's performance to a man's performance is likely the only way they can see or perceive the value of it, which is hot garbage, likely because society has always preached men as the pinnacle of athleticism, but that's a tangent. It could start to open them up to the merit of women's athleticism on its own. Or it could just continue to be an unhealthy way to keep viewing women as secondary and only select a few good enough to be in the league of men. I think your poll results highlight men's feelings of superiority in all things and the internal programming men and women have. So a really interesting take and submission, obviously, that I think she spent a lot of time thinking about. And I liked her take on it. That gave me a lot to chew on and think about. And I think in that, as women, we are very used to looking through the lens of both gendered experiences. And because of where society, like not a surfing issue, but more a society and how far we have come in women in athletics or in society in general. Obviously, this has been a long journey and a gendered journey. But here, like these guys have never had to have that experience of their surfing compared to someone that they're not even, that is not within their league or their, their gender or whatever. But women are really used to that we, growing up, that was the highest compliment I could receive. And I was used to that being the highest compliment. Like I thought so too. I was like, oh man, wow, you thought like you mistook me for a guy out there? Like, wow, that's pretty cool. That must have really meant that was like surfing great. I think that response like had a really nice articulation, just focusing on how men are used to like seeing things through the lens that they're used to seeing them through. And that's why I think it is important to have a variety of voices within the booth. And to add on to that, I think like what I don't want this conversation to come across as like a men hating conversation, because it's not about that at all. I think we need to live in a society where we are working together. Be like, what a sad society if it's like, oh, only women support women surfing and only men support men surfing, and we just like stay in our like gendered lanes over here. Like, no, I want to hear from respected voices of both genders, and because they come with different takes and different experiences on men's and women's surfing. And I think that's completely legit. I think that's really interesting. And, I think I don't want to come across here and say, well, all the men are coming around as like, well, they're superior and they're walking around in this way. I just think this is how our society has been. And that is like a result of that. And that these conversations aren't being had, Shan. Like you said, it's not being picked up anywhere that there was no woman in the booth at Portugal for 3 years in a row now. Like we're just used to seeing that. And so I think by having this conversation and trying to go against the grain and saying like, hey, why aren't we questioning these things? Like, why don't we find this a question mark? And I do think this is a responsibility of both women and men equally to be having these questions and these conversations. Like we're a society that works together. And I think I get frustrated at the WSL in this space over the past few years when Portugal lands on International Women's Day and they do this big PR stunt. Like last year or the year before, it was every athlete, not just in surfing, but in ever, like favorite woman athlete's last name on the back of their jersey. And that's what they wore. And it was this big PR stunt and whatever. When the actual change that they should be doing is a quiet one, that they're just hiring half the women to, giving women's voices, putting women's voices in the booth. Like that's actually what makes the difference in our sport, not this big PR stunt, not even just like collabing with us as a women's podcast. It's not about stunts. It's about long lasting impact into women's sport and women's surfing and women's voices and women's journalism, like all of that, and so enough with like the PR stunts. Let's just actually see women in the booth in Portugal and all events. But for some reason, Portugal seems to be this one that's like, doesn't have women at all.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I've got a couple comments to go on that. I'll go with this one really quick, and then I'll go into kind of I feel like it's kind of my final thought on this whole thing. But there's plenty of women available to hire for that event. Like there's no excuse not to. And even to the context of like, maybe, you know, it's too expensive to hire the Australians, and they've used a lot of Australian women over the last few years. I've really enjoyed that. But looking at, you know, how far it is to fly to get to Portugal, those kind of things. Maria, who's on the broadcast now in Brazil, every time that they run a Brazilian Challenger Series event, or now the CT, like she's a booth commentator for the CT on the Brazil event. So Portugal and Brazil share the broadcasting hiring between the two. So there would be a lot of Brazilians being flown over to work the Portugal event, vice versa. She should be someone considered in that conversation in an instant. And she speaks Portuguese, and like all of the little, you know, often they're trying to like bring in the right voices that touch to maybe the culture or something along those lines for where they're landing. If somebody has a language skill and that's where the event is happening, they take place, it gets precedent, which I'm like, that's cool. That's all great. Why is Maria not being hired for this event? Like she is, you know, kind of an up and coming commentator, but she's doing a fantastic job. She should actually like absolutely be on the ground, as well as some of these more like well-known names that we get to know on the women's side of things. So that said,
wait, can I cut in there?
Yeah,
actually,
go ahead.
Because, and to your point of saying like, oh, maybe it was too expensive to fly Australians out to Portugal. I want to then give credit where credit's due to the Australian team over here that actually has been investing, hiring
hugely
women in the booth. And that's here to that APAC team actually I watched that happen when I worked there, putting Laura in, putting Dimity in, putting Flick in, like these are voices in the booth. And I really enjoy hearing their voices and their take. And I've been enjoying seeing that. But you're right. Like we do operate in an organization, we see an organization operate that is regionally focused as well. And so we've seen that poured into the Australian region here. We've seen Jess Grimwood. We've seen True Starling get their chances on the Challenger Series. I am not seeing that happen in the North American region at all. I'm not seeing happen obviously in the European region at all. And like, why is that? And yes, we've been speaking to the broader WSL too, but I'm actually going to point out and say like, it has happened here. And now, like, because the Australian office has been doing that, they're actually flying these Australian women that have been poured and invested into these other regions rather than continuing to pull from, like work on that talent within their regions as well.
Also, it's not that there's like and this is, I feel like a good unfiltered conversation at this stage around this topic, because we kind of, I don't know. Anyways, they're the ones that are setting the standard for who's good enough to get put into these positions as commentators. There's no like qualification process to it. It's not like being a judge where you have to go through your training and then you're working, even starting out in board writers, and you're getting some like learning opportunity. You're then jumping into maybe a QS 1000 and literally working your way up and earning your position to be a judge on the championship tour. There's nothing like that for commentators, right? Like there's no course that you can take. There's just nothing from a training perspective, which is often why we suddenly see someone thrown in like a Jessie Mendez, first time ever, has never commentated before. They're just going to chuck him on the championship tour. Same thing happened with Palmatier.
For an analyst, the prior qualification usually is previous world champion, previous professional surfer, surfing on the tour, like, you know, or host side. It is more of like maybe journalistic background. There are like these other provisional qualifications, but you're right. There's not like a set, provisional qualifications to like be considered. They're not just going to pick Joe Schmo off and say like, have you watched surfing? We want you to be the analyst.
I mean, there's been plenty like that. But yes, in that greater context, you're totally right. I don't mean to discredit like the accolades that you've earned as an athlete to give you the right to have a voice in that setting. But basically, the WSL has thousands of people that they could be choosing from that context who are former, championship tour athletes across all of the generations. We're talking like ASP into WSL. There are a lot of people they can be pulling from. There's a lot of people that are going to be well-spoken, that are critically thinking about these kind of things, having the kinds of conversations with their friends and family. that, Rachel, you and I are passionate about, or that we want to be listening to from the commentators that are tapped into watching these kind of things. Coaches make great analysts. Maybe they had a decent competitive career themselves, but also pitching into that coaching role gives them an even better opportunity to share their thoughts and their opinions. Also, other side note, a field that is massively lacking women, where there's some women that are coaching around the world, but we want to also hopefully one day see that increase to more former competitors as women stepping in as coaches. All of that to say, the WSL could pick anybody they want to, and that's what they're doing. They're like, my impression then is that they're going, throw this guy in. He's doing a decent enough job. We'll teach him what to say and what not to say, and we'll give him a few little notes here and there. The women have a much harder road to the WSL justifying using them in those roles, which is why there are so few women available to be put into those commentary positions. It's why we see a lot more women hired really consistently in that analyst role across the championship tour through the year, where the men's analyst role gets shuffled through, and we'll maybe get a person for a few events because it's in that region or something. We'll get like a Richie Levitt when it comes to working in the Australia region. He'll most likely be on Bells, Margaret River, Gold Coast, Newcastle. Maybe we'll see him at Fiji or something because it's also in the region. But we're not going to see him flown across, and they're going to tap into another guy with other great background and that sort of thing. They're doing this to themselves, as far as like, they can't complain that there aren't women capable of doing this role. There's so many women capable of doing this. It's just that they're not giving those opportunities in the first place. And I love what you said, Rachel, about it filtering in, not just, we're not just hounding in on the championship tour here. We're talking about the regional sides of the organization as well. The fact that North America needs to work on this, the fact that Europe needs to work on this, the fact that Asia needs to work better on this as well, though there have been more women also commentating in the Asian region on those lower events. Africa has done a great job through the years, not always incredible, like inconsistent. There's a lot of guys that kind of hold down those positions. That's where I got my start. Australia is kind of where then I got my foot into like the next step in my career. So those two regions probably doing the best out of anywhere in the world at really grabbing the women that are, have the right energy for that kind of role and starting to put them in when they're still really young and give them that opportunity to learn how to be the best in their field. Like a Jessie Starling, we're going to see her on sidelines for like a lot of the Australian leg. And that's so exciting to see a really young girl in her early 20s get that opportunity to jump across on that side of things. So yeah, that said, my kind of final thought to this is, when you go to go far, you have to go together, right? Or however that quote lands. I'm not saying it very well. The old proverb, right? To go far, you go together. I think it's like to go fast, you go alone. The best thing in sport or in anything is when we can work together at this. Like my dream teams when I get to commentate is when we've got a really good equal field of men and women that I'm getting to chat to. And at some heats during the week, I'm getting to sit next to a woman. And at some heats, I'm sitting next to a man.
It doesn't matter if interesting dynamic,
Exactly. It doesn't matter if we're commentating on men's or women's surfing. It's the fact that we're getting to commentate on surfing that we appreciate. And the conversations I get to have with you are different than the conversations I'm having with Barton Lynch. Those are the great things. And that makes an interesting, a dynamic commentary team. The same thing goes for literally everything else. And I think there is like this overarching feeling, and I've read this a little bit more lately in some other sports journalism stuff, of just the idea that like, if women's sport starts doing good, it threatens men's sport. That shouldn't be the conversation. It should be like, men's sport does better as a whole when women's sport is also doing better, because sport is then moving forward better together. That's the dream. Like, that's the end result that we're looking for. We're not looking for this like, let's tamper down what's happening in women's sport because it might accidentally chip away at an audience that was just watching men's sport because it was there, and suddenly they realize they like women's sport more. So we lose audience numbers and we lose franchise numbers and whatever. There's not as much product or something being bought in this because that money's being divided on this side. The best situations are when both sides are supporting each other and that growth continues to support each other. And I think that's like a huge conversation that's been happening in the NBA specifically with basketball is like starting to see that growth of women's sport, and that the men within the men's side of the sport are in a very positive way supporting the women's side, and that growth can then happen together rather than this fear that if one starts to take off, the other one's going to slack just because. And I think in surfing, we also, in some aspects, we're there. In a lot of other aspects, we're absolutely nowhere near that. And it's still this fear that if women can join into that aspect, that conversation, whatever it looks like, that men are going to suffer because of it. And that's really unfortunate, because for us to go farther, we need to go together. And that's a much better situation to be in.
Yeah. And where we started, obviously we've started this conversation about the comment on Gabriela Bryan's frontside turn, and that being compared to the men. And then that turned into this conversation about women's voices and general voices within the booth and things we want to be hearing from and listening to. But to kind of circle it back to that initial conversation on talking about women surfing through the lens of women surfing, I think overall that when you have women's voices talking to that, when you have men's voices talking to that, when you have all looking at women surfing through the lens of women surfing, that's the best. I think that's awesome. And I think that's where we thrive the most, and I think that's how you support the sport the best. I think to kind of land this conversation for our listeners listening to this, like whether you're a woman or a man, I would love for this discussion to just like kind of make you sit and think about like, actually, what would my gut reaction be to seeing an entire women's team talking towards surfing? Or why do I think that would be why do I actually think that's a compliment to say like a woman's turn is as good as half the men on tour, and because we're so used to that stuff. And I think this conversation is like taking a second to pause, like, why are we so used to that? And deconstructing the reasons why, and finding that some of those reasons are rooted in just like a society that has held like men's sport at the pinnacle, and trying to reframe that and say women's surfing can be the pinnacle of women's surfing, and men's surfing is the pinnacle of men's surfing. So to land this discussion of where this sits for our listeners, to just like sit and think about that, or have conversations within your circles about what do people around you think and why. And I think that's like overall the most important, is like having that why to your thinking and reasoning. And if it is one way or the other, it's like having that good thought process as to like why you think that way.
Yeah, Rach, I think that was a really good way to land this, because we have kind of taken a few different, tangents within the conversation, as we tend to do. But yeah, I like that idea. Even for us, like we've been having this conversation. I've kind of been rehashing my thoughts about things. I've really enjoyed listening to reading the audience kind of feedback on some that are pro, some that are against it. Like all of those sides, there's been some really great and interesting points from both sides. So I think I like that kind of, what's the right word? It's not like a call out. It's like like an exhortation or like a challenge to us to be like, okay, well, let's just now in this context, as this comes up, whether it's in surfing or other aspects in life, why are we okay with just what's been happening? Are we okay with it? Are we not okay with it? Where does it sit with us in this conversation of maybe comparison amount around women and men in that sporting context? That said, thank you for listening to another episode of The Double Up. Rachel, we have talked about lots of things this week. It's been fun, and I'm excited for our next monthly wrap to see what happens with the next couple contests on the calendar.
And we loved your guys' feedback throughout the poll and the conversations. Like what we heard from you guys, the pro and against comments in our DMs really helped us form our conversation around this and have a lot of discussion around this. So I would love to hear more feedback off of after listening to this, like, or what landed for you guys, what didn't. And we'll see how this conversation continues to develop, because, Shane, I think we're never going to sit here and flag that we're 100% right on everything. This is just like our forming opinions as we flag things and go like, wait a second. And, I think like you said, where we go farther together. And so continuing to communally have these discussions is how we best like forge our way forward. So yeah, with that, send us your thoughts and feedbacks to our Instagram.
Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again shortly.
Bye.